Shain Shapiro is founder and CEO at Sound Diplomacy. Sound Diplomacy advises cities, governments, and industry on the tools to unlock the economic, social, and cultural value of music. And we're speaking today as venues across the UK plan to turn their lights red later to highlight the problems that live events sector is facing during the ongoing coronavirus crisis. So Shain, you've just published a report, Music Cities, a Resilience Handbook, which looks at what cities can do to better support music venues. Can you tell me why you published the report and what its main findings are?
I think we published the report to explore mainly cost-neutral mechanisms, things that that you can actually get cities to do right now to better support the wider music ecosystem, so live music venues, but also the creation of music IP, education, and regulation, and so on. And prior to COVID, we weren't an industry that I would argue was as well invested in civically as other sectors. In some ways, we have kind of outsourced our talent development to multinational companies via Spotify and Live Nation and others. And I think that we all appreciated and we all kind of have emotional attachments to our music venues, but the regulatory infrastructure that supports these places as economies was fragile pre-COVID. So obviously, we all couldn't predict this happening, but music venues were the first to close, will be the last to reopen. And if we all genuinely care about music and culture, if we think that it's an important thing to have in our urban fabric, then we need to think about different ways to better understand the role that music plays in communities. And so the idea behind the handbook was to outline what that is, outline what the problems are prior to COVID, because there are lots of them, and then some solutions that mainly city governments and those related to city governments like tourism boards or economic development corporations or chambers or things like that could do now, so that if and when we come out of this, music and culture can be better positioned economically, socially, and culturally in cities and become more resilient. So that was the idea behind it. And to be frank, I just wanted to produce something positive. Like I just wanted to outline something that that inherently gave some optimism, whereas right now there isn't a lot to be optimistic about in our sector. So.
Well, I suppose during lockdown, musical events, whether it was opera from Italian balconies or people playing bands in the street, one of the few optimistic events happening that you saw on television on a regular basis, people were getting together and making music.
I always liken it to clean water. Like clean water is only important when you don't have it. And I think that we all see music in the same way. The ubiquity of music, it's the fact that it is available to anyone, anywhere, for free or for very, very cheap, means that we just always think that it's always going to be there. And unfortunately, that's not the case. It's a supply chain and an ecosystem like anything else. And we have seen that socially, music is important. Yeah, the whole singing on balconies thing. But economically, as a sector, it has had to fight tooth and nail for any support. Governments are more concerned bailing out airlines than they are to support their wider cultural ecosystems. But in some sense, that there's been some really positive things happen just after quite a lot of lobbying from the sector.
But it is fragile. I mean, you say that the public is consuming art, music, and culture at an accelerated rate, but they're not contributing enough financially to ensure that artists, musicians, and creatives can actually meet their own basic needs. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, we have this. I'm not blaming anybody because I do this too. We have this cognitive dissonance where we we focus on the created and ignore the process of creation. It's the same thing in real estate. When the building's built, it doesn't really matter how it was built because it's there and it's there to be used. And, I don't think about the construction of a building as much as I probably should when I'm immersed in it. A song is exactly the same. So when we hear a song that we love, we don't think about the economic supply chain that led to that song happening. And music is an exercise in failure, right? If you think about it, you have to fail a lot to create something great, because you don't just come up with a song. Well, very few people do. There's so much trial and error is expensive. So this cognitive dissonance that we all have, where we all value the ubiquity of music. I have already listened to about an hour and a half of music today, and I wasn't actually thinking about the process of how it made it to me. And unfortunately, the way that the music industry works is that the scale is shifted a little bit to support the middlemen and middlewomen, right? And disseminators of content rather than the creators of content. And that is a centuries old problem based on how our industry works. But it just simply, the pandemic has demonstrated that it doesn't work. The whole concept, when everyone uses the word gig economy, well, where did that come from, right? So it's this idea that if we value something, then we need to put in far more substantive structures to support the creation of the value. And that is easier in some places and harder in others. Like, we work all over the world, and, sometimes my arguably democratic socialist concepts of creating structures to support creators does not fly in some countries. But in Europe, in continental Europe, and in some instances here in the UK, there's been, quite substantial support structures offered to creators. But I think that this has to be a global solution because it's a global problem. And especially now, when I was actually having a conversation with a client of ours, a developer client of ours prior to this. And now the only way that we're going to create yield, I believe, is by focusing on community. Because if everyone is stuck locally, more or less, then we need to sweat local assets more. We need more stuff, the whole idea of the 15-minute city. We need more stuff around us. And the more varied stuff around us means that I believe, could create greater value by creating greater value capture. And music plays a role in that, right? So, and maybe it's going back in time, because in the 60s and 70s, there were music venues everywhere in London, right? You could play in like Harlesden, and then in Hayes, and then in central London. You could tour around London. Now everything is centralized in Shoreditch or central London. Maybe this is a return to the way it was in the past.
So at the moment, obviously, London is seeing a lack of visitors coming from outside the city. So we need to depend much more on our local market, really. And there's 9 million people in London. That's a pretty big market for any sector. So what do you think the mayor and his Night Tsar could be doing to better support music business in your eyes?
Yeah, I think they're doing a lot of really good things. Just so everyone, I worked as a consultant with the mayor's office for a long time, and I was involved in the creation and development of the Night Tsar position. So I'm super biased, and I know the mayor's team around music and culture and nighttime economy. The mayor's office is this. I find this very, very interesting kind of juxtaposition where you have an administration that in some regards has no power but tons of influence, right? It's in terms of licensing is a local issue, or planning, I guess, is a local issue guided by national issues, other than the mayor being able to call in applications. So I think that in terms of guidance, research, advocating for music venues, being behind the scenes in terms of getting money out to venues, the mayor's culture risk program is really good. I think that they're doing really well. I just feel that in a city of 9 million people, as you said, you can't, it's impossible to help everybody. And so there's always going to be challenges. And I think that's, one of the things that I do believe they're doing that we can continue to improve is to promote a sort of genre agnosticism, as we would call it, in reference to how we think about supporting music, art, and culture. So this isn't just about music, but we our classicist past means that certain genres of music have been very well supported, and others less so. There are even some genres of music that have been de facto criminalized in the last few years. I'm hoping that, and I do believe, and I know that they see this because we talk about it, that this pandemic just outlines the value of culture, regardless of what the culture is, and that a rapper in their bedroom is as culturally important as a string quartet, that they're both important. I love both. So I hope that we can see more understanding of that. And then that also offers up opportunities for how to use distressed assets, whether they're retail assets or what to do on the ground floor, all of that. I think that the more we know about local culture, the more we'll be able to incorporate it into schemes and hopefully, regenerate through that. I'm optimistic. I'm maybe cautiously optimistic.
But perhaps if we look at the wider economy and the potential of tourism created by music, you did a report recently on the market for music venues in London, and you said we could arguably support 7 major venues. Could we see that sort of music as part of the recovery of the economy after the pandemic, and what do we need to do to actually make that happen?
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, we wrote that report for Madison Square Garden Company in relation to the Sphere development in Stratford, which I believe is still in planning. But London has a far less large venues per capita than its competitors. Simple math that, New York and Madrid and Paris have more big meaning kind of 10,000 capacity and larger. This is why one of the O2 is the world's most successful venue, because it's a great venue, but it also kind of has a competitive advantage, and we do believe that if London, especially post-Brexit, is going to be a cultural hub for the world, and I think that that's probably what we need to be pinning our hopes on, is that arts and culture get us through this, and creativity and tech, and as I said, mining what's in our heads rather than what's in the ground. We have to look at the spaces and places that we need, and create more provision for them. So one of the brilliant things about London is that there's a lot of space, mainly out in Barking and Dagenham and East, but also Old Oak Common, and we have some of the biggest regeneration sites in Europe. I think Old Oak Common is the biggest. I could be wrong. I'm a music guy, but I think that's the argument that London doesn't need large scale arenas and large scale venues is I believe not true. By the way that the market has pre-COVID has demonstrated how people consume live music. So a couple anecdotal things. One is, this was back in 2017 or something, where we looked at there was one year that of all the tickets sold at the O2, about a third of them were Michael Bublé, because he played like 15 or 20 dates that year, and he's incredibly popular. So that just demonstrates that's one artist who can sell dozens of arena shows. Same with someone like Elton John. And we also believe that because the O2 pre-COVID booked very, very long into the future, upwards of sometimes 12 to 18 months into the future, because there's only so many dates you can hold, there's opportunities for another arena of that size, and it would not in any way negatively impact the business of the O2. We think that it would actually be strength in numbers. So, but at the same time, right now we have to prioritize London's grassroots music venues because they're the ones that are most at risk of closure, and we don't get Adele's and Ed Sheeran's and and these famous artists without these small venues. And so I believe one of the ideas that is being floated around right now, which quite a lot of work is going into, is the idea of trying to bundle some of these venues into a trust, and the trust buying the freehold and then leasing it back as a particular venue use at a modest yield, so as to kind of take the market away from the venue. And if a grassroots music venue simply cannot provide the rent that any other use would bring, a Tesco Express or a McDonald's or a block of flats, if that venue has cultural significance to that community, then we should consider that as value. So I think that there's both sides, and the mayor's office has been incredibly supportive of both. I think they're super progressive and forward thinking in terms of how they support music venues. But everywhere needs to improve. So I think on both sides, we could support both. And again, it goes back, like, how many local areas in London had a grand, right? Like a Clapham Grand. There were grands everywhere. Town halls used to do gigs. I'm sure you went to a bunch of them, and now we don't do that anymore. And I think that we should be rethinking opening up, local halls, local infrastructure for live music when we're safely allowed to do so.
I think that sounds a great idea, something NLA definitely support as well. Although I noticed actually that Madison Square Garden Sphere has been put back by the planners to the client now to come up with more information about access and transport. So that's not going to happen any time yet, I guess. But
that makes sense. It's a tricky site.
Very tricky.
I get
that. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Shain, thank you very much indeed for your insights. It's been really fascinating to speak to you, and we'll certainly follow the growth of small venues in London. I think the idea of the trust is really, really interesting. So thank you very much indeed.
No, well, thank you, and thank you to the NLA for shining some light on this issue. And we're just saying, start a playlist. Let's get the NLA listening to more music. All right.
Very good. We'll do that too. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.